Hi, folks. Welcome. Thank you so much to the morning panelists for an amazing presentation. The Couscous project is so inspiring right now, and just such a wonderful driving force in the conservation story of the Comox Valley. It's very, very heartening to hear that story. I would like to acknowledge from my office here in Cumberland that we are here today and presenting on the traditional territory of the Aitken, Punlitch, and Comox First Nation. And this is the regional collaboration for Watershed Resilience session. I'm going to start by introducing the panelists who are going to be joining us today. I'll start with myself. My name is Megan Curzons. I'm the Executive Director of the Cumberland Community Forest Society. We are co-presenters with the Comox Valley Land Trust and Conservation Partnership of this three-part virtual seminar. I am also a community educator for a program called Connected by Water, which is an outreach and education initiative of the Comox Lake Watershed Protection Plan. So I get a few different ways to be involved in this really interesting story. Joining me on the panel today is Chris LaRose, the Senior Manager of Water and Wastewater Services for the Regional District. Chris is a professional engineer with 16 years of experience in regional governance with a background in mechanical engineering. He has expertise in energy management, zero waste, district energy, waste to energy, and has most recently crossed over into water and wastewater. He's a senior manager, as I've said, of water and wastewater for the CVRD. And he leads a department of 25 operators and engineers managing our regional water and sewer system. In this capacity, Chris is coordinating the CVRD's participation in the MNAI, Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, which we'll be discussing. It's a watershed pilot project, an effort to better understand the value provided to the region by the Comox Lake drinking watershed. Next is Michelle Molnaire, and Michelle is an environmental economist and policy analyst at the David Suzuki Foundation. She's also technical director of the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative and an environmental economist, as I've mentioned. Her work focuses on the conservation of natural capital using various tools of ecological economics, policy analysis, and public outreach. She's the author of several natural capital valuations and the past president of the Canadian Society for Ecological Economics, and sat on BC government's Climate Solutions and Clean Growth Advisory Council. Kevin McFedrin is the Village of Cumberland's Parks and Outdoor Recreation Coordinator. He's been supporting parks and trails planning, operations, and capital improvements for the village for over 8 years. He led the village's part in the Project Perseverance Partnership Project, which we'll be talking about today, supporting property acquisition and covenant development for a recent 90-hectare addition to the Cumberland Community Forest Municipal Park in the Perseverance Creek Watershed Basin. Kevin has worked in park and protected area management for his career. Prior to the village, he worked for BC Parks on the central and northern Vancouver Island. So welcome to the co-panelists. And we are going to get right into things. So take us forward. There we go. So welcome to the Comox Lake Watershed. This is a beautiful and complex space that much of our conversation, over this 3 days circles around. It's 461 square kilometers and reaches from the top of the glacier and the surrounding mountains down to Comox Lake. It's the source of drinking water for 49,000 residents of the Comox Valley, and also one of the largest portals to recreation within our region, including freshwater swimming and boating. Of course, it's traditional to territory of the Comox First Nation. For thousands of years, Indigenous peoples have occupied this land of plenty. And the glacier at the peak of this shared watershed is embedded in the culture of our community. It's in street names and place names and school names, and the story of Quenishan, the big flood, looms large in our understanding of the connection between the place that we live in now and those who have stewarded this place for a very, very long time. Comox Guardians tell stories of Comox Lake as being a path of transport between the east and west sides of Vancouver Island, and the cedar canoes would be sunk in the winter for storage at one end of the lake and then brought up after the lake had unfrozen or thawed in the spring to transport back and forth between the island. The Beaufort Range was another one of those crossing places. The Comox Lake Watershed, another way to look at it is watersheds within watersheds. And it's a way of breaking down something that can, in some ways, feel like a very large and somewhat overwhelming space. If you look at this map, it starts to show these sub-watersheds or these additional basins that flow into Comox Lake. Familiar names like the Crookshank River watershed, or Pierce Creek, Beach Creek, Boston Creek, and of course, the upper Perseverance, or sorry, upper Puntledge River, as well as Perseverance Creek and Cumberland Creek. If you look on the right side of this slide, you'll see the Perseverance Creek watershed, which we will be talking about later on in this discussion. This is another sort of a different perspective on the watershed. It doesn't put north at the top, but allows us to look at it with the top of the mountains at the top of the image. And you'll see the orange line, which shows that outer area, the catchment area. So everything within that orange line flows into Comox Lake. And we're defining the Comox Lake watershed as the source of the Comox Valley's drinking water. So all of the water that flows downhill within that orange line flows into Comox Lake, which is the source of the drinking water for 49,000 residents. Now, of course, the Perseverance Creek watershed is also a drinking water source for the village of Cumberland, and subsequently Royston via separate water service in the Perseverance Creek basin. So another perspective here is that art. I was talking about how Comox Lake and the glacier loom large in the imagination of our community, but it really does. And as a person who works also in an interdisciplinary way around conservation issues, it's remarkable the number of local artists who have captured the beauty of this watershed and the Comox Glacier to share. I have an interesting story here on Vancouver Island, though, related to land ownership. The lands of all of Vancouver Island, the unceded territory, was granted to the Hudson Bay Company in 1849 for the purpose of colonization and extraction of natural resources. Again, in the early 1870s, a man named Robert Dunsmuir, centered here, acquired 2 million acres of this land grant. It was called the E&N land grant to build a railway from Esquimalt to Nanaimo. And if you look at the photo on the far right, you will see the scope of that land grant. And that map really does define the land ownership legacy that we deal with in the southeast quadrant of Vancouver Island, and the fact that all of these unceded lands have been privately held for over 150 years. Comox Lake Watershed is an amazing, rich mountaineering history. You know, in 1910, Strathcona Park was declared. There's incredible stories in our community around early climbs of the Comox Glacier. It's a really rich mountaineering history in our community. And then logging also started very early, the early 1880s. The logging started in the Comox Lake Watershed. And the lands there have been owned by successive landowners ever since. The Comox Logging Company was out there. This is a A-frame crew in the 1920s, we believe. And essentially the entire watershed, except for steep slopes that were entirely inaccessible, were logged through that time period, including creek and river mouths. It was a very different time in terms of how harvesting was done and how logging was done. Early on as well, this site is the site of Cumberland's number 4 coal mine. And this was one of the most coal was extracted from number 4 of any of the coal mines surrounding Cumberland. But what's interesting about this location is right on the shores of Comox Lake, and anyone who's familiar with a location called Coal Beach or next to White's Bay, it was formerly the site of the number 4 coal mine. So it's a complex place. Multiple landowners, many recreation access points. It's the single largest source of drinking water for the Comox Valley, but there are so many different values that are involved in this landscape, and so many different people that are involved in this landscape because of this interesting history. I'd like to start with some of the critters. It's also, healthy ecosystems produce healthy drinking water. And so we like to introduce a few of our friends. This is the northern red-legged frog, which is a species at risk. And this is the little brown bat, one of our favorites, who both reside in this watershed and who are both part of the complex ecosystem web that makes the watershed such a special place and such an excellent provider of drinking water. This is the dam. So in 1912, power generation started on Comox Lake. to supply power to local coal mines. And of course, that's another layer of changing the state of the lake and turning it from this naturally occurring basin to a reservoir that's impacted by the dam that is run and owned currently by BC Hydro. This is the road, if you're familiar, of that side of the lake as you head out. This is the Comox Lake main, and this takes you out into, this is essentially a logging road that takes you out to the lands that are managed by Mosaic. Mosaic opens these lands at certain times of the year and certain times of day for recreation access, and they have relationships with recreation providers who are able to go out there to access trailheads. Because of course that road is the road that takes you to some key access points for backcountry hiking at places like Mount Century, Sam Lake, and the Comox Glacier. But I just want to give you a little introduction to some of the other players out at Comox Lake, because this helps to inform this larger thematic around collaboration. This is the BC Parks Ecological Reserve. Some people don't even know that this exists, but it's this incredible parcel of land. It's south facing, and it's a really interesting space because it's a Mediterranean type ecology. We have lots of arbutus trees and interesting ecology that's happening there that is really indicative of change that may happen over time in our part of the world as things get warmer and drier. So the ecological reserve is there on the north shore of the lake. Next up, I'm going to introduce the Fish and Game, Courtney Fish and Game Protective Association, who are a significant player at the lake, and they have a beautiful site out there, which was formerly a log yard with an incredible view of the Comox Glacier. This is the BC Hydro recreation area. So the photo on the left is an area that you can access just past the bridge. There's a swimming hole just below the dam, and on the other side is a photo of the BC Hydro trail system. And this is an interesting topic as of late, as we as a community begin to understand that part of this landscape fragmentation includes situations where land and timber license have been separated from each other. So in this case, BC Hydro owns the lands and Hancock Resource Group owns the trees. This is Coal Beach, formerly the site of the number 4 coal mine, and this was recently acquired by the CVRD as part of their watershed protection plan. This is Sunset at Cumberland Lake Park, run by the Cumberland Lake Park Wilderness Society, and this is also one of the main public access points for the entire region to Comox Lake, quite a responsibility borne by the village of Cumberland. The view from top of Devil's Ladder. There's an incredible climbing community and climbing resources on that side of the lake that many people come and seek for recreation. And here's another view from the top of Devil's Ladder. Somebody feeling pretty good about being up high above the eagles. And then another stakeholder, of course, is the Comox Lake cabin owners. And some of these relationships go back, almost a century and are deeply linked to the culture and fabric of the community. And families who over many, many generations have had lease cabins on the lake in partnership with the timber companies. This is Perseverance Creek, as one of my favorites because it's been my focus of effort for the last several years. Beautiful system in the Perseverance Creek Watershed. Again, just another gorgeous shot. On September 1st, 2020, we officially purchased 225 acres or 90.6 hectares of the Perseverance watershed. And this is a partnership between the Comox Valley Regional District, the Village of Cumberland, the Comox Valley Land Trust, and the Cumberland Community Forest Society. There's an incredible conservation covenant on these lands that protect them for watershed protection, biodiversity protection, and low impact recreation access. So here it is, this beautiful and complex space. It's complex because of all of these different landowners and interests and values. It's also complex because it will be impacted by climate change. Really succinctly, we are shifting from a snow dominant landscape to a rain dominant landscape. We're going to be seeing a lot less snowpack, and we see that through some successive winter droughts, and we're going to be seeing a lot more rain. And some may think that's a good thing, but snow is storage and rain is like your taps are on all the time. So a landscape that can hold and retain water is critical for climate resilience and water security. So collaboration is key when we name all of these different partners that are involved: industry, recreation, conservation, local government, BC parks. You see how watershed protection is truly an exercise in regional and collaboration even beyond the region. And that's the theme, of today's conversation. So that's your introduction to the Comox Lake Watershed if you're not familiar, and maybe a deeper dive even if you are. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Chris LaRose.
Thanks for that great introduction, Megan. I really appreciate the way you've set the context for us. I speak fairly often about the watershed, but I don't often, the audience doesn't often have that level of context. So I think it'll be really, really useful. As Megan mentioned, my name is Chris LaRose. I'm the Senior Manager of Water and Wastewater here at the CVRD, and I lead the department that manages the regional water and sewer systems. So I'm really happy to be here with you this morning to talk about the Comox Lake Watershed and some of the collaborative approaches that we've taken to work towards sustainability of our drinking water supply, and a reminder that this watershed is the only source of drinking water for the core areas of the Comox Valley. Let's see. Did that advance?
Not yet, but there's a little delay always. Try either the arrow. There we go.
There we go. Okay. So building on the great background that Megan provided, I'll start with a bit more about the relationship of the Comox Lake Watershed to the Comox Valley's main drinking water service. So the Comox Valley Regional District stretches from the Salish Sea on the east, including Denman and Hornby, to the Beaufort Mountains and Strathcona Park on the west. It covers approximately 1,700 square kilometers, and includes 3 municipalities, Courtenay, Comox, and Cumberland, and 3 electoral areas, A, B, and C, with a total population of roughly 70,000. As Megan highlighted, at approximately 460 square kilometers, the watershed occupies a fairly large fraction of the overall region, approximately 1/3. So roughly 2/3 of the population of the Comox Valley falls within the service area of the Comox Valley water system. So the Comox Lake Watershed is the only source of water for the system, which provides bulk water supply, treatment, transmission, and storage for Courtenay and Comox, and a CVRD local service area in the rural areas that wrap around that core. So water from the Comox Lake Watershed is conveyed through a system of transmission pipes to 6 reservoirs with a combined capacity of about 31,000 cubic meters, or 31 million liters. And these feed a variety of different pressure zones throughout that service area. And these storage tanks provide approximately 8 to 12 hours of useful storage volume during peak water demand times of the year. It just highlights how much water the community uses during that time of the year. The municipalities have their own distribution systems, and then the CVRD manages the distribution system for the Comox Valley Water Local Service area in the nearby surrounding rural areas for approximately 5,000 or 6,000 people. So between the core and the rural service, approximately 49,000 people rely on the Comox Lake Watershed as their only source of water. So the system is governed by the Comox Valley Water Committee, which includes representation from all of the local governments in the valley, except for Cumberland. The Cumberland have their own water supply, which is separate from the Comox Valley water system, but it's drawn from the Perseverance Creek watershed, which is actually one of the most significant tributaries of the Comox Lake, and therefore the Comox Valley water system. So in a very real sense, the Comox Valley water system and the village of Cumberland water system share the watershed. So the current intake to this system is off of the BC Hydro power generating infrastructure. So the photo on the left shows the impoundment dam in the center of the photo, and the logging bridge that was on one of the last photos that Megan had in her presentation. So that dam controls the level of the lake and the flow of water down the Puntledge River. Located approximately 3 kilometers downriver from the impoundment dam, BC Hydro's diversion dam, which is shown on the right, diverts water down the BC Hydro penstock, which is a 10-foot diameter pipe that conveys water from the diversion dam down to the generating station, which is at the end of Powerhouse Road for any of the locals. The current intake for the Comox Valley water system is actually off of that penstock, just above where the water enters into the generating station. So that connection to the penstock has been there for about 50 years. It served us very well as a community, but there's some significant drivers that are pushing us to install a dedicated lake intake. The most important of which is the reality that in an extreme drought year, the Puntledge River could run dry, which would leave our community without water. So river water quality has been fairly good over the years. And with Island Health's support, we were planning a new lake intake with the added step of an ultraviolet treatment to our source when the valley experienced a significant increase in the frequency and the severity of peak rain events. And that was in the 2014-15 timeframe. So partway through a 49-day boil water notice, in early 2014, Island Health amended our operating permit to require the construction of a filtration plant. So after many years of planning, consultation, and seeking funding, the treatment plant project is now over half built, with completion targeted for the middle of next summer. So with a price tag of roughly $125 million, which translates to $86 per year increase in water rates per household within the service area, the project includes a lake intake. So that's a new intake located approximately 200 meters off of the Fish and Game boat launch, very close to that logging bridge crossing the top of the Puntledge River. It also includes a raw water pump station, so on the edge of the lake closest to that intake, which then pushes the water through a new 2-kilometer pipeline to the treatment plant, which is located very close to the diversion dam, and an entry point for the Bevan trails in that area. And then after that, the water will be treated there. It'll be pushed down a new 5-kilometer pipe that runs parallel to the penstock and ties into the existing system, very near where our existing system ties into the penstock. So while the shift in intake location will slightly decrease the size of the watershed, it's a modest change as the entire lake watershed remains upstream from our intake. While many in the valley believe the drinking watershed should be locked down, similar to how Metro Vancouver and the Capital Regional District's watersheds are locked down, the reality is approximately 2/3 of the watershed is owned by private timber companies, and most of the remaining third is provincial parkland. And the CVRD really has very little direct authority or control over what takes place in the watershed. And this was the genesis of our collaborative approach to watershed management. Because really, without co-management of the watershed, each of the landowners and recreational users will be acting independently for their own purposes. So given the multi-ownership governance nature of the watershed, when we were directed by Island Health to develop a watershed protection plan, the CVRD convened a Watershed Advisory Group to help guide development of the plan. So approximately 25 members ended up on the Watershed Advisory Group, and some of those are pictured here on the slide. This is one of the bridges crossing one of the arms of the Crookshank River, which is one of the biggest tributary to Comox Lake. As you can see, it was a very rainy day, but everybody's very happy to be out there and exploring the watershed. So the WAG, as we affectionately call it, includes representation from the forestry company, so the largest landowners, environmental stewardship groups, recreational associations, elected officials, and local government staff. It was initially developed to help guide development of the plan, but it's now evolved to help guide implementation as well. So through the entire process, we've seen a high level of engagement and buy-in from the participants, which has been really, really heartening. And I think it serves as an excellent model. So the plan was completed in 2016, and it's intended to be a living document, so updated on a regular basis. In fact, we're planning a revision to it over the coming months, so working intensively with the WAG. It includes identification of 29 key source water risks, and then 54 recommendations on how to mitigate those risks. Additional key focuses of the plan are building a better understanding of how the watershed works. So through water quality monitoring, weather stations, and building the data sets through which we can better understand how it works and how it's likely to change, or how it is changing over time. We're also focusing on educating the public about the importance of this key piece of natural infrastructure to the community. And lastly, looking for opportunities to undertake strategic land acquisition to further the goals of the Watershed Protection Plan. So that brings us to the next topic. So when the CVRD was approached by the Comox Lake Land Corp with the offer to purchase a large piece of land at the east end of the lake, so 113-acre parcel, commonly referred to as the Cole Beach property, one of the main motivating factors was that the existing zoning of that property would have allowed uses that were inconsistent with the intention of the plan, such as possibly including a campground or other more intensive activities. So the CVRD purchased this lakefront property to ensure that its management is aligned with the recommendations of the plan. So the property is very well used by a range of users. Some of them having used it multi-generationally. Some activities such as responsible day use, like very likely aligning with the intention of the plan, but others, like some of the extensive motorized vehicle use of the property, possibly not. So we early on identified the need to undertake a management planning process for the property. So we've retained a consultant, Urban Systems, to help with the development of the plan. And we've established a subcommittee of the Watershed Advisory Group to help assist with the process and guide it. Our first step has been a detailed resource inventory process, which has been recently completed or in draft form. And the next steps are currently under discussion, but will definitely involve engagement with the KFN, the Village of Cumberland, the Watershed Advisory Group, Watershed Committee, and a range of other stakeholders. It's clear that due to the proximity of the Cole Beach to our future drinking water intake, this was a strong candidate for acquisition, but you might ask the question, well, how do we consider what other areas of the watershed might be vulnerable or at risk and good candidates for acquisition? So condition assessments of the land and the way that the ecosystems function is definitely a key part of that, but also the opportunity for leveraging water system funds through acquisition of land in partnership with others whose interests align is also very attractive. So case in point is the recent acquisition mentioned by Megan in her presentation. So a large piece of land along the Perseverance Creek. So working in partnership with the Cumberland Community Forest Society, the Village of Cumberland, the Comox Valley Land Trust, that parcel was recently acquired and a restrictive covenant put on title. So Kevin McFedrin will be touching on this in greater detail in a subsequent presentation, but at a very high level, the interest of all the partners clearly align with the protection of this land, which includes significant riparian areas along the lower Perseverance Creek, which, as I mentioned, is a very significant tributary, arguably the most significant tributary when it comes to the water intake, as it experienced very high flows at certain times of the year. It can be very flashy, and it is prone to high turbidity. So the land will be owned by the Village of Cumberland with specific watershed protection for the riparian areas that are embedded in a joint covenant and referred to as the Watershed Protection Zone. Further condition assessments of key areas elsewhere in the watershed are needed and planned, in fact, are underway. And those will inform a longer-term land acquisition strategy. But in the meantime, opportunities such as this to leverage investment through partnerships will be considered. Another key initiative under the Comox Lake Watershed Protection Plan is a partnership with the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative. And Michelle Molnar will touch in greater detail on that on a subsequent presentation. But I'll just say this, that local governments are pretty good at managing hard infrastructure like roads, pipes, sewers, libraries, buses, but we're traditionally ignored the significant values provided by natural infrastructure, and we're no different locally here. But when I learned about the MNAI's watershed-based initiative in 2018, I was immediately interested. I mean, the reality is that we have no backup source of water, and climate modeling, local climate modeling, has indicated a likelihood of an increase in the occurrence of conditions that affect water quality, such as turbidity, and quantities, such as flooding and drought. So developing a methodology for valuing the watershed will allow us to dedicate appropriate resources to improve the resilience to the coming changes. I also appreciated their desired multi-stakeholder approach and felt strongly that the relationships that we've established with the WAG would be easily transferable to the initiative. So we partnered directly with the Village of Cumberland and the KFN to fund the initiative, our portion of it anyway, and convened a working group that did have a lot of overlap with the WAG. So at a high level, as I mentioned, Michelle will get into greater detail, but at a very high level, the goals of the project are to understand the current and possible future roles of the watershed in providing safe, reliable drinking water for the service and the residents of the valley, and to develop strategies for the effective management of the watershed based on the understandings that come about through the process. So the inventory and condition assessment are the foundation for modeling of scenarios and economic value evaluation. And it's hoped that the outcome of the work will help support the business case for continued investment in watershed protection, both on an annual basis and potentially over the long term further property acquisition. So just to summarize before I end and pass this over to Michelle, first of all, effective watershed management is clear. It's only possible through close collaboration with stakeholders. I think it's fair to say that all of our interests align with a healthy, sustainable watershed. And lastly, that innovative approaches are clearly needed to help protect these resources and guarantee the continued investment over the long term. So that's it from me. I will end my sharing and pass you over to Michelle Molnar to speak about the MNAI.
Well, thank you, Chris. That was perfectly set up my discussion. Good morning, everyone, and I'll just share my screen here. So give me one moment. Okay, perfect. So I've been asked to speak to the MNAI Comox Lake Watershed project. And I'll start with a caveat. Although we are close to completing the project, I won't be sharing any of the findings today. It's really important for our project partners to have the opportunity to review and provide feedback before we release anything publicly. But what I will do is tell you a little bit about MNAI, as well as our approach and how we use that approach in the Comox Lake Watershed. I'll speak to what drew us to the project and really how it's acting as a template for other watershed projects. So let me just start with a little bit about the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, or MNAI. We're a not-for-profit organization made up of a small team and a board of directors. And we recognize that nature is one of our most vital infrastructure assets. So natural assets such as forests, wetlands, and open green spaces contribute to delivering essential services that we rely on every day. Services like clean drinking water, clean air, and flood management. They're also central to any climate resilient infrastructure system. So we need to treat our natural assets as core infrastructure. Now, to this end, MNAI helps municipalities measure and value the local services that their natural assets provide. And in turn, this helps municipalities properly value them when they're planning and managing their infrastructure. So over about the past 6 years, we've worked with about 20 communities, shown on the map just on the right of the screen there. So why is it important to do this? It's important because we have a dire scenario playing out really around the world. On the one hand, local governments are feeling squeezed because they're responsible for managing about 60% of our infrastructure with just 10 to 12 cents of each tax dollar. On the other hand, climate change is creating more extreme weather events more often. In many communities, what used to be a 1 in 50-year storm event can now happen several times in a week. And in 2017 alone, 160 billion liters of raw sewage overflowed from combined sewer systems. So essentially, this means our existing stormwater management systems are simply not handling downpours effectively. So a large portion of the infrastructure in Canada is nearing the end of its useful life. Significant investment during the 1950s and 60s is now reaching 60 to 70 years old. And with this aging infrastructure, municipalities can expect an increase in maintenance and operating costs and significant increases for renewal and replacement costs in the near future. Now, in response to this, municipalities are now mandated to practice modern asset management, which is an integrated, systematic process to meet required service levels in the most cost-effective manner by managing assets for present and future customers. So it really embraces a life cycle approach and strives for continuous improvement. Now, the emphasis in asset management is on sustainable service delivery, as opposed to the underlying asset that delivers those services. So this means that natural capital can form a core element of asset management strategies, since natural capital may provide or could be restored to provide ecosystem services that communities rely on. So ultimately, from the lens of a local government, this natural capital forms a class of natural assets that deliver municipal services in the same way that an engineered asset would. So with that said, what are natural assets? The term natural assets in green infrastructure are often used interchangeably, but they do have different meanings. So natural assets refers to the stock of natural resources and ecosystems that deliver a flow of benefits to people. Green infrastructure, on the other hand, also includes designed and engineered elements that have been created to mimic natural functions. So MNAI tends to work more on the left side of this diagram, but really we're talking about more of a continuum because many people realize that natural assets have been enhanced by people over time. And in the pursuit of managing them, we often get into engineered assistance. So our approach really aligns with Asset Management BC's framework. The framework really focuses on desired outcomes rather than prescribing specific methodologies. And this allows local governments to develop and implement an approach that can be adapted to their unique local conditions. The framework describes asset management as a process, really providing a guide to the what and the why of asset management with a high-level review of the how. So it's a principal resource for local governments looking for strategic direction or guidance on asset management. Now, essentially, MNAI's framework guides local governments in how to address those unique considerations that asset management requires. And we help to answer many of the standard questions of asset management for natural assets. Questions like, what is the inventory of your natural assets? What is their condition and can it be improved? What level of service does it provide? What is its value? How will it respond to changes in demand, whether we're thinking about climate change or development pressures? And how will local governments maintain that over time? So to answer these questions, we bring multidisciplinary teams to complete place-based modeling and economic analysis. So this approach has benefited the communities we've worked in a number of ways. First, it brings improved understanding and recognition of the services provided by natural assets. So while we know that nature provides benefits, the level of benefits often isn't known. Our approach helps communities understand natural asset benefits in more detail and in a quantifiable manner. And this really helps with local decision-making, which is generally taking place in a concept of multiple competing priorities. Secondly, it's been shown to improve climate resilience. So in our work to understand the condition and service levels of natural assets, we complete modeling to understand current as well as future scenarios. Future scenarios often include climate change, and we found that natural assets are much more adaptable and resilient under modeled scenarios. Now, in addition to climate adaptation benefits, they can also have mitigation benefits, both because they may be deferring construction or gray infrastructure, but also because they could be sequestering carbon. Thirdly, our approach helps to build the business case for conserving and restoring natural assets. Economic values that are based on modeling outputs can be utilized to build that case. So communities that we've worked in, such as Grand Forks and Gibsons, have utilized the findings from our studies to secure funding for restoration. And the region of Peel has utilized results to start to build a cost-benefit tool to really demonstrate and compare the benefits of natural and gray infrastructure. We've also seen the development of bylaws that support the role of natural assets. So for example, the community of Grand Forks is exploring new floodplain bylaws that expand the scope of floodplain risk assessments to look at community risk as a function of slope, geomorphic hazards, water velocity, and other variables not usually included in floodplain bylaws. And then two other bylaw developments have been gaining a lot of interest. Gibson's development permitting bylaw, which considers developments more holistically by initially assessing options to preserve, maintain, or enhance existing assets and the services they provide before proposing new built assets, is being looked at a lot. They've also amended their development cost charge bylaw, and they now collect development charges for improvements to natural areas. Other local governments in BC could do the same to direct more resources to natural asset regeneration and maintenance. And last, but certainly not least, many communities have realized cost savings by pursuing a natural asset management approach. They generally have no upfront costs and lower operating and maintenance costs. Okay, with that said, let me turn to the Comox Lake Watershed study. So I think Chris set this up perfectly. He's reviewed the range of partners that were included in this project. So Comox Valley Regional District, Comox First Nations, the town of Comox, the city of Courtenay, and the village of Cumberland were all involved in this. He's reviewed the goals, so I won't review them again, but I will say that the objectives that we pursued in support of this goal really included quantifying the value of the Comox Lake Watershed as a natural asset and a critical component of water quality to the drinking water system. And then secondly, we looked at the associated costs and benefits in the case of Cumberland relative to engineered alternatives, but in the case of CVRD, we looked at it relative to long-term operations and maintenance for engineered assets. So what attracted us to this project? Many things. I'll just highlight some of the key ones here. First, this is MNAI's first watershed study. From the early days, we were very interested in applying our approach at a watershed scale, as this is ultimately the proper ecological scale to consider natural assets. Now, we knew this was going to be a challenge because our political systems are not used to operating in this way. So how do you square ecological boundaries with political boundaries? And furthermore, how do you include all the other key players in the watershed process? And I think the work that has been done in the Comox Lake Watershed really highlighted this as the first area to do this in. Secondly, this was the first time MNAI has worked with First Nations as a project partner, the Comox First Nations. And through this, we've really started to understand the unique context of First Nations and how we might position or adjust our offerings to better suit their needs. We've also explored an enhanced valuation approach through this project. So our approach to valuation thus far has been fairly narrow but deep. So we focus on a select range of stormwater services and complete modeling to understand the capacity of natural assets to supply those services. We then ask if that level of service had to be replaced with built infrastructure, what would that cost? Now, with the Comox Lake Watershed project, we were able to follow roughly this approach in respect to Cumberland, who are still relying upon natural assets to supply drinking water, as Chris mentioned. But the Comox Valley Regional District, as Chris discussed, has recently committed to building a water treatment plant. So in this case, we asked how natural assets might mitigate operations and maintenance costs and potentially defer pre-treatment upgrades. Secondly, we also are completing a wider valuation of the additional benefits of the watershed to provide a more comprehensive picture of the value of the watershed. So this component of the valuation is broad and shallow. The values are not based on modeling, but on existing studies from other locations adjusted to the watershed context. So third, the fact that the Watershed Advisory Board in this region and the strong collaboration that was built really, as I said, contributed to this becoming our first watershed project. So collaboration and the building of trust amongst different groups takes time. And we had the fortune of dropping into that and being able to direct the group's attention to a shared foundational value, drinking water. So during this project, we had 3 workshops. This is a photo of the last one, with a planned additional meeting to really share the project results and discuss next steps. We also had the opportunity to complete some community outreach and consider co-benefits. And during that time, we were able to gain the local context from experts on the ground, people like Megan and Corey Frank. And we tapped into local expertise throughout. So I should say during these meetings, it wasn't just the project partners, but it was industry, it was folks involved in recreational services in the area. It was expertise from local scientists. And so we used and were able to tap into some of that expertise throughout. So people like Tim helped us refine our approach for assessing the condition of watersheds. And Corey from Tetra Tech helped us refine and really define our modeling approach. And lastly, transferability to other watersheds. So lessons learned through this project are being transferred to a project we're completing in Ontario. Now, while this work in Ontario is benefiting from the involvement of a conservation authority, which has been studying the watershed for 40 years, there's no collaborative advisory board akin to the Watershed Advisory Board. So this is certainly something that we'll be suggesting to them. And it's also informing what we're calling the Source to Sea project, which is taking place in Gibsons, where we're looking at their watershed and asking how it will connect with findings from a coastal assets project we're completing with them. Ultimately, to consider the path and functions of water as it moves from the headwaters right to the sea. So I'll just say that this project really has taken a village, and I want to thank everyone who was involved. There's no way I could have mentioned all of them for their valuable contributions. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kevin.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Michelle. So I am Kevin McFedrin, as Megan introduced earlier, the Parks and Outdoor Recreation Coordinator for the Village of Cumberland. And while my position is essentially parks and trails centric, in the environment in which we recreate in Cumberland, we inevitably overlap with a whole bunch of other interests. So it's, I guess you could say, multidisciplinary in approach, several other resource management topics at play, which is, I believe, why I was invited here this morning, given my role in many of those things inevitably involves a collaborative component. So I will just very briefly on occasion step out of that role a little bit and speak to a few other things just for context reasons in this presentation. But just to be clear, I'm neither an engineer, a water system operator, or a forester. I'm a parks guy. So where we're gonna go. So yeah, thanks to Megan's introduction, and then of course Chris spoke to it a little bit further. But I'm really just going to zoom in on the Perseverance Creek Basin, which is the village's interests. It's also my backyard and the backyard of many others of the Comox Valley in terms of where we recreate. And I'll describe a little bit our drinking water system, similar to what Chris did for the CVRD, very briefly, and then really dive into some details on the village's lands. So these are where our my responsibilities are really focused. We own land in the Perseverance Creek Basin under two different designations. There's forest land and then park land. And then finally, really discuss the collaboration, which is the key to our success when it comes to, trying to find that balanced approach amongst all those different values that Megan spoke to earlier. So yeah, it truly is a web of partnerships and relationships, and we do rely on others in order to make it all work. When it comes to things as diverse as drinking water supply, natural assets, watershed protection, conservation, recreation, forestry, industry, let alone a complex legacy of other resource activities, mining, etc. So the Comox Lake Watershed actually stole this map just off of one of our trail signs, which you'll find out in the Cumberland Trail Network. So you are not here, that red star, that's not where you are right now. If you're familiar with Cumberland's trails, that's up near the Perseverance Creek Bridge, but that's why that's there. And what this depicts, the brown shaded area, as you have seen earlier, that's the Perseverance Creek subwatershed at Comox Lake. So that's going to be where I'm going to focus my presentation. As you can see, the village of Cumberland sits just outside the developed area of the village, sits just outside that basin and actually in an adjacent watershed that drains into Bain Sound. And so if we just quickly have a look at that for context, the village's core developed areas in Maple Creek's watershed, which drains into the Trent River, and then down through Royston into Bain Sound. And so the line separating Maple Creek Watershed and Perseverance Creek Watershed is really the height of land that separates the Comox Lake Basin and the Puntledge River. So again, area of focus will really be on this Perseverance Creek Watershed and its sub watersheds within that Cumberland Creek and the Allen Lake forming our water system. So a little bit more detail on the Perseverance Creek system. It's in total, it's 2,300 hectares. Its upper reaches are at the northern end of the Beaufort Mountain Range, approximately 1,000 meters in elevation, down to the mouth at Comox Lake, about 150 meters elevation. So to a lesser degree than Strathcona, certainly, but a lot of the precipitation in the winter does fall as snow at the highest elevation and then trends to a more rain-dominated regime down lower. Land management in this area really is complicated by a very diverse set of legacies left behind by previous generations. So as Megan mentioned, beginning in the 1880s, there was significant development of the coal assets in the area. So this has left behind old rail lines, tailing piles, vent shafts, mine sites, you name it. The evidence is out there in the woods surrounding and even right in the village itself. Of course, timber harvesting, the practices involved in that have evolved significantly over time. But again, there's a large road network exists throughout the Perseverance Creek Basin, mostly related to the forestry industry. And then, yeah, as I mentioned, there's just certainly been an evolving practices as new knowledge has come to light amongst the industry and related stakeholders when it comes to things like ecosystem science and hydrology and that kind of thing. And then, of course, there's our water system, which I'll speak to in a second, but there's a network of dams and spillways, and it's been a system that's developed over time from over the last 100 plus years. So it's seen various modifications and additions, some well-planned, some perhaps reactionary over the years, and we're dealing with the legacies of that now in this basin. More recently, the recreational interests have really become more of a focus for the community. On the lake, that's freshwater-based stuff, so boating and fishing, that kind of thing. And then Cumberland's really in the last couple decades become a real trail-centric community based on non-motorized recreation, hiking, trail running, and of course mountain biking has become a bit of a claim to fame. Which all happens within our community drinking water supply area, which, as Chris mentioned, is in the broader Comox Valley community's drinking water supply area as well. And then there's even some other kind of random things hidden amongst the woods. One of my favorite spots is adjacent to Perseverance Creek, and if you look closely, you can find there's the relics of an old steam power plant hidden in the woods as well. So inactive, but yeah, there's a lot out there, and you don't have to look too far to start seeing those remnants of the past. So just quickly for context, like I said, I'm not an engineer, but the Cumberland water system, a quick kind of overview on how it works. So if we go back to our fuzzy maps where you are not here, we've got basically two arms to the system. On the Cumberland Creek side, which drains into Perseverance Creek, actually in the Cumberland Community Forest, which I'll speak to later. There's a network, or there's a series of 4 dams, starting with Stevens at the highest end, down to Hamilton, something we refer to somewhat awkwardly as Cumberland number 2 dam, which is actually a reservoir, and then Henderson Lake Dam, where we have our first intake. And then the other side is the Allen Lake side, where there's also an intake at Allen Lake. Both those systems are gravity fed, so the pipes run down to our water treatment system, which has just been developed. There's now dual treatment with a UV reactor and chlorination. That goes into a huge treated storage tank, which has become a fairly obvious landmark out on the landscape. And then from there, the water flows downhill through a couple mains into the village and then into, well, Megan's and my taps at home. So that's kind of the context. And now I want to dive in a little bit more into the land management. And this is where we really get into the collaboration piece. So this map is intended to, well, all the lands, with the exception of a few of them in the top right, are within the Perseverance Creek Basin. The solid blue line running through the middle is Perseverance Creek. And then the village is the owner of all these different colored parcels. And I'll speak to them all specifically, but just for background, the undesignated or the village forest lands are in purple, and everything else, so the red, yellow, green, and blue, are Village of Cumberland parks. And all village-owned land. There's some nuances, though, in how they're managed, whether they're that parks designation or the forest lands. And it's somewhat related to history. So I'm going to start... I'll start higher up with the purple lands, the village forest lands, and then work our way down to the lands in the lower reaches of the system, which actually are outside of our drinking water supply area, but of course within the CVRDs. And collectively, these lands make up just over 500 hectares, which is a little bit more than 20% of the total basin. So the village is a major landowner within the Perseverance Creek watershed. Everything outside of that, the remaining 80%, is essentially privately owned. So that's predominantly owned by the two major forestry companies, and the lands are managed primarily for timber production under the Private Managed Forest Land Act and its related regulations. So the Village of Cumberland forest lands, this is 230 hectares of land. It's 7 unique properties. And 6 of them were acquired in 1950 from a utility corporation, which was likely some sort of subsidiary of the mining company. Then the 7th was around Allen Lake, and it was acquired in the 1990s. It was part of a land trade, and that enabled some improvements to that reservoir. Back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, the village took on some silviculture treatments to much of these lands, which are heavily forested. It's all second growth, but it's become quite mature. So this was some thinning works, and the result is they're from an ecological integrity perspective. Sorry, I'm just about to be interrupted. 1 second here. Hey. The pleasures of Zoom. Sorry, I'm in a presentation. Yeah, thank you. All right, back on track here. Our thinning treatment, yes. So, yeah, basically we're dealing with an area of lands these days. It's of fairly high ecological integrity. This 230 hectares of land, we're working through a management direction statement process, kind of like a management planning light right now. And so don't have final kind of outcomes on that, but this is something where we're basically just trying to create some future management direction for these. And where we're trending is the lands are obviously owned first and foremost for the protection of our drinking water interests, but also recognizing the need for sustainable recreation opportunities, that kind of thing. So yeah, primary objective, definitely watershed protection. The management direction statement process has been informed by an inventory, a baseline inventory work we did a couple years ago. So that really focused on the ecological and hydrological aspects of the lands, but also some of the anthropogenic infrastructure, roads, trails, dams, etc. So that's our forest lands. And now if we focus on our park lands, so these are managed more from that the dual mandate perspective of recreation and then ecological integrity. And so these are our 6, 7 parcels that collectively are village parks, but are broken up into 2 different parks. So in In red, yellow, green, or sorry, in yellow, green, and blue, we have the Cumberland Community Forest Park, which is a fascinating case study in parks itself. This is lands that were acquired using monies raised by the Cumberland Community Forest Society. And then in red, we have Coal Creek Historic Park. And then just outside of actually the picture up by Comox Lake, we have Cumberland Lake Park as well, which I will speak to very briefly at the end of the presentation. So these parks within the Perseverance Creek Basin total about 185 hectares of land. And so together with our forest lands, again, that's about 20% of the watershed. So the Cumberland Community Forest, this could be an hour-long presentation itself. If Megan was involved, it'd probably be a few hours. Fascinating stuff. And it all starts with a partnership between the village and the Cumberland Community Forest Society. So the society was formed 20 years ago with the desire to protect private lands from being logged adjacent to the community. And they approached the village at that time, who I think reluctantly agreed, okay, well, we'll take on the land ownership responsibility subject to you guys raise enough money to buy them. So it really, in essence, is a symbiotic relationship, but it really depends on the village. We're a very small municipality, less than 4,000 people, being willing to take on land management and ownership responsibilities, which is significant. What we've done is we try and tie the acquisitions or the targeted purchase areas to lands that we've identified of public interest in our Parks and Greenways strategic plan, which therefore is kind of the foundational piece that it's something of interest to our residents and taxpayers. I would also argue these lands have really become important to the wider Comox Valley as well. Speaking to some of Chris's content earlier, and then again from a recreation perspective, really being a bit of the trail network's a playground for really the Comox Valley. So the community forest identifies a block of land, and they lead the negotiations with the landowner. So they lead all the background work to coming up with the fair market value price, which is a fascinating process in itself. Land appraisals and timber cruises, timber appraisals, etc. Half art, half science, I think. But ultimately, this depends on another party, and that is the landowners being a willing seller. So in our case, we've been fortunate enough that Hancock has been both a willing seller and very much interested in sitting down at the negotiating table and entering into good faith negotiations. So we enjoy a good working relationship with them on that front. So the Cumberland Community Forest Society works on a purchase and sale agreement. The village is party to those discussions, make sure it works on our terms. We're ultimately the purchaser. And then the Cumberland Community Forest Society goes out and raises the money to buy it. The sources have evolved over the years, and I think the funding model has become more complex. As we've recognized, there's more opportunities. So kudos to them for seeing an opportunity from a watershed protection perspective to approach the regional district, who for our most recent acquisition of 90 hectares was a major contributor. Almost a third of the $2.5 million price tag was money contributed from the regional district in recognition of the drinking water protection value that acquisition provides. So once the Community Forest Society completes their fundraising, which I mentioned the CVRD, there's literally hundreds of other sources, including their membership, local businesses, other grant organizations, other recreational and conservation interest groups, BC Hydro, et cetera, et cetera. And so once they have the money, they transfer the land to the village, and the village becomes the purchaser, owner, and long-term manager of the lands. Now, how this all works is, in order to guarantee that protection for the values in which the lands were purchased, is there's a conservation covenant registered on title. So this guarantees that the interests of, say, this Comox Valley Regional District are protected on those lands. The covenant is held by the primary covenant holder, the Comox Valley Land Trust. They've been involved in all of the purchases of the Cumberland Community Forest, which just finished the 4th. And so they're the common thread amongst the 3 different covenants we have on 4 different parcels. For this latest acquisition, we have a couple new covenant holders at the table. The regional district is part of that formal agreement, as is the Cumberland Community Forest Society, who has recently become, they have become, I guess, approved as a covenant holding society by the province. So these covenants are, I think, in essence, kind of collaboration at work. Is you're trying to align the values, which we all agree are generally aligned between multiple organizations, but of course there are some different interests at play. And so how do you make sure that those interests are protected? And this is a slide, actually, this is kind of cool to see that both Chris and I are presenting. And this is an example of some covenant work at practice, say. So just quickly, for those not super familiar with a covenant, basically it's a fancy agreement between 2 or more organizations, which basically set restrictions on a property. It's registered on title, so if the village was ever for some reason to transfer these lands, any future landowner would be subject to the same restrictions. They're registered as part of the province's Land Title Act. We refer to these as conservation covenants under Section 218. And so what they do in effect is they really limit what the village can do with these lands, which work for us because it's a nature park for our community. It's an access point for low impact recreation. But of course, as there's more interest at the table, we have to make sure that those values are also recognized and protected. So the covenant's the tool that does that. So another way of looking at it is the CVRD, the Land Trust, and the Cumberland Community Forest Society essentially owns this bundle of rights on the land. And that, so they own the ability to protect, using this map graphic, the areas in orange and red, watershed protection zones and biodiversity protection zones. So really, these are areas that, although the entire property has limited call it development potential of any park's infrastructure, these areas are even more protected, recognizing those values on watershed protection. So the red zones, the watershed protection zone, really is the riparian area of Perseverance Creek. So what's immediately adjacent. And so what actually, it just ended up working out this way, but it's kind of cool that the red areas within the latest purchase, the 90 hectares, are about commensurate with the investment that the Comox Valley Regional District made in the acquisition. So they make up about 1/3 of that area. So that is the Cumberland Community Forest from kind of a background and a purchase and covenant protection perspective. Moving forward, we have our work cut out for us because another term of the covenant is the requirement to produce and implement a park management plan. So this is covenant provides some real broad restrictions, and then where we get into specifics on things like trail routing or restoration works or where signs should be, that kind of thing is in the management plan. So having just completed the purchase in September, haven't dove deep into this one yet, but that's imminently upon us here. And this is going to be another opportunity for collaborative work amongst all these parties. So we'll sit down and in addition to the community and public engagement, produce a park management plan that considers everything from recreation and trails to how to deal with old mine sites to restoration opportunities in the creek. The village has some utilities that run through here. There's hydro and water mains, you name it. The park management plan will be the tool that seeks to address any issues related to those broad set of needs and interests. So yeah, this will be an opportunity for certainly organizations like the United Riders of Cumberland as well to be at the table to make sure recreational interests and trails that they manage just outside of these lands, make sure everything works and speaks to each other. And then of course, watershed protection planning will be a part of this, recognizing the CVRD's interests and so, okay, so yeah, I'm going to leave it at that, but I am just going to make a comment that this map is generously provided by Megan. It's still in draft form, but what I like about this is it's less technical and more just about the community's interest in these lands and how we interact with them. So it's got some beautiful visuals, and I think this is an example of some of the horsepower that the Community Forest Society has really works complementary to the village as the land manager, and they're able to create things like this for use in the community and programming in schools. And so these are the types of things that I think through management planning and all those other tools we have in our toolkit are the opportunities that come about, is creating these super cool maps that then can be used by families in the community. So that's the Cumberland Community Forest Park. Called that 101. There's, like I say, there's a lot more to it, but that's some broad strokes overview. And immediately adjacent to it, Coal Creek Historic Park. So I'm going to zoom into that. This is also a village park, also entirely within the Perseverance Creek Basin. It's 42 hectares of land acquired by the village in 2002. And really the motivating factor at that time was there's two very prominent heritage sites in the park. Number one, Japanese Town and Chinatown. Super important to the village in its early days, the contributions from these communities. They're no longer there, but we've built interpretive walking tours to really acknowledge what they were and the contributions made. But what's also of interest to, and certainly this presentation, is the fact that there's several wetland complexes within this park, and they all contribute to Perseverance Creek. So the village completed a master plan for this park in 2014, and we use that zoning concept as well in it. And most of the park is natural area, and that really is intended to be left kind of as is and not developed for any recreational potential. There's a few trail corridors that run through the park, and then obviously the heritage sites receive different zoning, and they're managed primarily for those heritage attributes. And yeah, I guess another collaboration, those walking tours were really a partnership with the Cumberland Museum and Archives. So another really cool project I've got to be part of. I don't think this presentation would be complete though without a Cumberland Trail Network map, just because I think for anyone in the audience who's familiar with the Perseverance Basin, it's probably from a trails perspective. This is an incredibly popular recreation area. Last year, I believe it saw over 150,000 individual uses. This year, the numbers are tracking to show that there'll be even more people. So it's an internationally renowned area, and how it is managed is certainly done through collaboration as well. The areas in yellow, this is a dated map. That's the Cumberland Community Forest. That is village responsibility. So those trails are essentially village trails. Everything else is managed under a license agreement, or locally known as the land access agreement, which is between the two private timber companies, the village, and the United Riders of Cumberland. So UROC does manage a trail system on the village forest lands higher up around Hamilton and Stevens and the other reservoirs. And this, the license agreement really just obligates UROC to provide that trail management responsibility, recognizing the multiple values that it provides to our community, ranging from health and wellness and destination tourism and economic development, right through to the watershed protection that a trail management service provides. Both the village and the Comox Valley Regional District do provide funding support to UROC to maintain those obligations. So again, this is a presentation in itself, but it certainly needs to acknowledge that these recreational interests exist out on the landscape and are managed in a collaborative way. And yeah, certainly very important to the community, this trail network and the access to the forest that it provides. And then lastly, and hopefully there's still time for a few questions. I hope I'm not running too late, but is Lake Park. And I know later on in the symposium, there's a presentation from the Cumberland Lake Wilderness Society. They're this incredible group that the village has, well, it's essentially done under a contract, but they manage the park on our behalf. They formed out of a park management planning process back in 2014, recognizing the need for more community involvement in the management of that park, not just as a destination tourism asset, but also as a community asset. So they've done some phenomenal things with partnerships with the school district and other players to really reflect that balanced approach to accessing the lake at that point in time. And this park's just across the bay from where Perseverance Creek enters Comox Lake. So I think there's a couple minutes left. I'm going to pass it over to Megan, and yeah, we'll do a little Q&A session here. So Megan, over to you.
I am here. And so we're getting tight up against noon, but we will go a few minutes over that. And I'm going to start with a couple of questions that I see. One was around the usages. There was a question around whether golf courses use the water system, and subsequent to that, what is the largest group use of water from the Comox Lake water supply, Chris?
Thanks, Megan. Good question. So the first part, no, there is no significant use of community water by golf courses locally. It wouldn't be cost effective for the courses to use community water. So they typically seasonally collect water in their kind of ponds that are built in as features of the course, and then draw on that water to irrigate. But by far the biggest use of water is irrigation of residential properties. We see it's really fascinating to watch the increase in water consumption as soon as the watering times start. So we, in the winter, we'll be at, speaking in round numbers, we'll be at 15 million liters per day. In the summertime, we can go up to 50, so over 3 times, and the vast majority of that is directly attributed to irrigation. So that's definitely by far the biggest use. Yes, there are some large uses like industrial laundry or that type of thing, but compared to irrigation, it doesn't even compare. Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. So there's been a series of questions, and Tim has been really great in terms of answering these in the chat that were related to salmon and some sort of clarity around how salmon are getting to the lake at all. So if you want to have a look in the chat there, you can see that it is definitely that the BC Hydro Dam did cut off salmon from the lake, but then there's subsequently been fish ladders and channels put in place. There's a question here. How are the populations of bears and deer, for instance, impacted by the access of humans to these watersheds? I don't know. Let's throw that one at Tim.
Sure. Well,
Tim?
There's a number of ways, I think, and it depends on how far back you want to go in time, but the populations of deer, elk as well, and bear, cougars, and all those wildlife have been accumulatively affected by the activities of humans on the landscape. Of course, the indigenous people took specific land management actions to enhance the populations of those resources, including things like prescribed burning. But when we came along and built the dam in 1912, for example, we flooded out a whole bunch of low elevation, large diameter forests that would be perfect bear denning habitats, for example, and then proceeded to log the other large diameter trees that bears often would use for denning. So, you know, and I think in the chat box, you'll notice that we have had some discussions about salmon populations in the lake. I would consider those to be a shadow of what their former selves would have been like, given that the anadromous salmon access was cut off for over a century. So I think the bear population probably would be suffering somewhat from that, but mitigating that, of course, is that you know, active forest harvesting would actually enhance to some degree access to food for bears, including the vegetation that you see them often foraging in clear cuts, berry production and things like that. So at the end of the day, we don't really know for sure whether we're winning or losing with bears, but I would say that there certainly are a lot of them in the watershed. Elk, we nearly hunted to extinction, and through different management now are really rebounding throughout the island, which is fantastic. You know, and deer populations on the island are consistently high. So, you know, from a megafauna perspective, in the back end of the watershed, things are looking pretty good, I would say. But we need to be vigilant about protecting habitat, for example, ungulate winter range habitat for deer. You know, and we need to be setting aside special areas for that, and perhaps returning to a regime like the First Nations did, where we're actually working on managing land to enhance their populations.
Thanks, Tim. I know, Michelle, that you may need to duck out, so I just really want to thank you for your participation in case you disappear on the screen here for us. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'll just circle back for just a couple more here. There's another one here for Chris. I think, Chris, you're going to get a lot of these ones. One is around source water protection. And is there a distinction here between source water protection and a watershed protection plan? And they relate to the Walkerton, Ontario event. So are there plans to protect at the source? And then there's a second question regarding metering. Is there political will to introduce metering? I'll respond that we actually have it in Cumberland, but there's a broader conversation to have there. So why don't you grab both of those, Chris?
Sure. Thanks, Megan. So yeah, I think, you know, we consider the Watershed Protection Plan the source water protection initiative. I mean, that's it. You know, as I mentioned in my presentation, you know, we're not in a situation like Metro Vancouver or the Capital Regional District where, you know, a long time in the past, they were able to secure the land surrounding their watersheds. And I think that, you know, that's very much related to what Megan provided that as part of her context, the ENN land grant. You know, locally here, you know, compared to Metro Vancouver and the Capital Regional District, where their watersheds were surrounded by Crown land, here we very much are dealing with the legacy of that ENN land grant. So there's very little, you know, very little, if any, Crown land in the watershed. It is all privately held or park. So the Watershed Protection Plan is our source water protection initiative. You know, it is a multi-year, multi-decade approach, but we're well underway. Regarding the second question, metering. So I think, you know, certainly it has been a controversial issue in the past, but the municipalities and ourselves have been quietly getting on with it. Comox has a policy of installing meters as development occurs and as services are replaced. So they've gone over the 50% metered mark, and that's for all sectors. In Courtenay, they've almost fully metered their multifamily and commercial properties, but haven't been doing metering of single family yet, although they are putting in meter leaders when they are working on services to make it easy to drop in meters in the future if and when meters are developed as a policy in Courtenay. And then in the for the 2,500 properties in the surrounding rural areas, they're all fully metered. So it's not like there isn't any metering. There's actually quite a bit locally, but I think there seems to be more interest recently, and you might see an acceleration of that over the coming couple of years.
Thank you. So in the interest of respecting people's time commitments, both our presenters and all of you who have chosen to share the morning with us, we're going to wrap this session up. I want to thank Chris, Kevin, and Michelle so much for your participation. And I don't think this is the end of these kinds of educational opportunities. I know whenever we've been involved in telling this story, we get excited about doing it again. It's a really complex and interesting story, but it is a really exciting one around the potential for collaboration, even under some of the most challenging land ownership context. And I don't think the story's over yet. And the amount of activity that's happened in the last 5 years has been quite phenomenal. Before we plug tomorrow morning's session, I just do want to comment again on the presenters for this event. This virtual seminar presented by the Comox Valley Land Trust and Conservation Partnership, the Cumberland Community Forest Society, and the CBRD's Connected by Water Initiative, which is the public engagement and education arm of the Watershed Protection Plan. We'd also like to thank our sponsors, the Pacific Salmon Foundation and Lush Cosmetics, who have also supported this project. And then I would also like to give a real shout out also related to the Perseverance acquisition, to the Fish and Wildlife Compensation Program, who've showed up several times in this conversation. Them and the Habitat Conservation Trust, in addition to our local conservation partners, have been real significant players on the landscape related to conservation, and really want to acknowledge those as well. So tomorrow morning, we have 2 sessions, and they're very much built on this Connected by Water thematic, and also how climate change is influencing how we're doing our work. Just huge gratitude to spend this Thursday morning with all of you. It looks like a beautiful day in the Comox Valley, so I hope everyone gets an opportunity to go enjoy these wonderful natural spaces that we're conserving together, and go drink a big glass of water and be grateful for where we live on the planet.